We are very pleased and we are honored and privileged to have Professor Clayton Crockett to give us a talk for our public lecture series sponsored by Confucius Institute. His talk will be Chinese Postmodernism, Representations of China in French Philosophy from 1967 to 2012. Professor Clayton Crockett started teaching at UCA in 2003, and he's the author of 3 books. Most recently, the book Radical Political Theology, Religion and Politics After Liberalism. It was published by Columbia University Press, and he's also a co-editor of the Columbia book series, Insurrections, Critical Studies in Religion, Politics and Culture. And from 2008 to 2009, Professor Crockett was the outstanding faculty member of the College of Liberal Arts, and in 2010 he won the University Research Award. So without further ado, Professor Crockett.
Thank you, Dr. Gorn. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for coming. I'm teaching a course right now, which is called Postmodern Theology, and I think that this, the term postmodernism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and I don't know that it has one distinct meaning, but for me, I'll give you a provisional definition. That is, postmodernism for me gives a perspective to ask questions about the nature and stakes of modernity. And so if we think about modernity, I think that modernity, or the modern world that we understand, is not maybe exclusively, but is predominantly a Western European concept. And so the shift from the modern to the postmodern provides, at least potentially, an opening beyond a narrow Eurocentric view. That is, it dislodges, or at least calls into question, this Western Eurocentric perspective. And so, if by way of following that opening, my expertise, my background is sort of French postmodernism, French poststructuralism, which is still Western and European, but looking at how China sort of comes into and plays an interesting role in the development of this French postmodernism and poststructuralism. So, his presentation examines the influence of China, including Chinese political and economic events, as well as French sinology on French poststructuralist philosophy. I take 2 distinct approaches. First, I'll survey a series of Chinese influences on French thought over time from 1967 to the present. Second, I'll make a more constructive argument about French poststructuralist philosophy itself and argue, based partly on the work of the sinologist François Julien and the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, that there are 2 distinct versions of French postmodernism, one which is based on an image of folds and foldings that is more compatible with Chinese thought, and another one based on an image of a break or a cut that is less compatible with Chinese philosophy. I'll spend most of the time on the first part of my talk, which is partly a historical overview, and then briefly at the end raise the idea of these 2 kinds of postmodernism. In the beginning, in his important work of grammatology, published in French in 1967, Jacques Derrida cites the historian of China Jacques Chernet's work on Chinese language, which Derrida uses to critique Western logocentrism and its privileging of speech over writing. In Part 1, Chapter 3, which is called Of Grammatology as a Positive Science, Derrida examines how Western approaches to language have valorized phonetic writing based on a closer tie, or presumed closer tie to human speech, over more ideographic systems of writing based on signs. A consideration of the Chinese language serves 2 distinct purposes for Derrida, one negative and one positive. On the one hand, the Western study of Chinese reinforces universalist assumptions about written language as a separation from oral speech, because Leibniz and other early modern Europeans, quote, encouraged seeing in the recently discovered Chinese script a model of the philosophical language thus removed from history, unquote. Derrida criticizes this appropriation of Chinese as a kind of universal philosophical language without any history, and he compares this to the efforts to read and decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. On the other hand, in a positive sense, in a more positive sense, Derrida affirms the fact that Chinese written language offers an alternative, non-phonetic form of writing, which is important to contrast with Western phonetic writing, so long as the Chinese language is not absolutized or romanticized. This is a complex argument, but Derrida appreciates the work of Journet and other French sinologists for their work on understanding Chinese thought and language, even as he criticizes some of the conclusions they draw. For example, Journet says in another book that for Chinese thought, the order of beings and of the world is best translated by systems of variable dynamic symbols. Perhaps Chinese writing is not unconnected with these deep-rooted tendencies, which have ended up by giving a privileged position to the written sign at the expense of the spoken word. So, written sign, spoken word, this is the opposition. Derrida wants to resist valorizing either the written sign or the spoken word. He wants to show how both word and sign originate in a complex movement that he names arche writing. It's just a term that he makes up. But arche writing is a word that Derrida coins to designate the fact that there is no simple origin of speech and writing. He deconstructs this opposition, drawing on contemporary and historical studies of the Chinese language. Both speech and writing, Derrida says, are animated, quote, by an unnameable movement of difference itself that I've strategically nicknamed trace, reserve, or différance. This consideration of Chinese and how careful attention to Chinese language deconstructs the simple opposition of sign and word plays a key role in Derrida's most important text, and this section that I just talked about opens up onto Derrida's more specific reading and critique of how Jean-Jacques Rousseau opposes nature and culture, and Derrida goes on to deconstruct these two simple oppositions. Next section is on the Cultural Revolution and May 1968. Derrida says that, quote, ever since phoneticization has allowed itself to be questioned in its origins, unquote, a process in which the study of Chinese language by Westerners has played a large part, quote, its history and movement is seen to mingle with that of science, religion, politics, techniques, logic, and art. Law and art. Unquote. Political events in China also had a powerful effect on French philosophy and culture. There are important political connections between the Chinese Cultural Revolution between 1965 and 1968 and the French insurrection in May of 1968. And afterwards, Maoism became an important political and intellectual influence on the French left in the 1970s. As shown in the book by Richard Wolin, The Wind from the East, French Intellectuals, the Cultural Revolution, and the Legacy of the 1960s, the Cultural Revolution inspired many French intellectuals who were disillusioned with Stalinism and the French Communist Party. Although many of the understandings of conditions in China at the time were deficient, these intellectuals enthusiastically embraced a kind of French Maoism in the wake of the uprisings in Paris led by students and workers. Wolin says that, quote, in the post-May period, the Maoists reveled in the seducements of libidinal politics that had suffused the student-worker uprising, unquote. This French Maoism was divorced from the situation occurring in China, but it provided an energy for philosophical and intellectual revolutionary projects that expressed fidelity to May 68 in France and through May 68 to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, despite its excesses. Many French intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, were sympathetic to Maoism without being Maoists. The most significant French Maoist was Alain Badiou, who has emerged in the 21st century as the most important living French philosopher. After the translation of his masterpiece Being an Event, published in French in 1989, and then in English translation in 2006. In his philosophy, Badiou attempts to formalize being in mathematical terms using set theory. At the same time, in contrast to this set theoretical ontology, an event is precisely what erupts without conditions, leading to a transformed situation. Badiou has, in his understanding of an event, remained faithful to the event of May 68. And Wolin writes, Quote, whatever their empirical failings, in Badiou's estimation, both the Cultural Revolution and May 1968 stand as living testimonies that revolutionary subjectivity possesses a singular capacity to destroy the obstacles standing in its way. In some of his more recent works, including a book called The Communist Hypothesis, Badiou has written about and assessed this Maoist legacy on his thought. According to Badiou, what the Chinese Cultural Revolution represents, even in its failure, and he admits it was a failure, is still the impressive effort to dislocate revolutionary politics from a central party. Badiou says that in 1966, the Maoist effort, quote, envisions the destruction of the political monopoly of the party. It's sort of Mao opposing the party itself in order to try to continue the revolution. Ultimately, in 1967, the Shanghai Commune effort fails. The Red Guards get out of control and they're then violently repressed. The army reasserts its authority, and Mao is forced to resort to a personality cult in order to retain control of the political situation in China. Badiou concludes that, quote, Mao was the name for the construction of socialism, but then also for its destruction, unquote. Mao, seeing the reaction against the revolution that occurs within the party, tries to overcome the party itself, but he fails. In the end, says Badiou, the Cultural Revolution, even in its very impasse, bears witness to the impossibility, truly and globally, to free politics from the framework of the party state that imprisons it. So even if it fails, Badiou is still very sympathetic to the attempt in terms of what it was trying to do, as he understood. Although Badiou has retreated some from his Maoism and downplayed the role that he previously granted to destruction in his thought, he has not renounced it. Badiou claims that we are still contemporaries of May 1968, and we are still undergoing the effects of this powerful event, even though he acknowledges that in some ways the real hero of 68 is unfettered neoliberal capitalism, which Badiou opposes. Even if neoliberal capitalism is the result, Badiou is still committed to the transformative experience that the insurrection brought about, and he remains committed to a politics of emancipation, which is what he says the communist hypothesis means. Neoliberal capitalism says that the only thing that matters is getting rich, but Badiou says that we cannot truly live without a revolutionary idea. He says, I am telling you as a philosopher that we have to live with an idea, and that what deserves to be called a real politics begins with that conviction. Travels in China, next section. In 1974, a group of French theorists associated with the literary journal Tel Quel made a trip to China. Tel Quel was an avant-garde journal founded by Philippe Soler, and Soler, along with his wife, the French-Bulgarian philosopher Julia Kristeva, and literary critic Roland Barthes, who had just written a book about Japan called Empire of Signs, they went on a trip to China for 3 weeks. This trip was organized to show these sympathetic Western intellectuals a positive image of China, and it had a powerful effect on them. Kristeva, a French feminist, published a book called About Chinese Women, contrasting Western women with Chinese women. Barthes was more interested in aesthetics and also in sex, and his notebooks from this trip were published in French in 2010 and translated into English last year as Travels in China. For many French, including these travelers, the Chinese figured as human others, other with a capital O, at a time when French philosophy was obsessed with otherness and difference. Unfortunately, many of these portrayals of Chinese men and women are stereotypical, exoticist, and ethnocentrist at a time when China was less about a reality and functioned more as a trope. As Richard Wolin explains, the issue became the China in our heads, citing one of those French enthusiasts, as the flip side of a revolutionary enthusiasm for Maoism. The sinologist, Francois Julien, who I will discuss later, says that he was drawn to study China by an interest to learn another way of thinking that was very different from Western philosophy that he was steeped in and learned. In the 1970s, after Mao died and China was undergoing economic liberalization, many French intellectuals, including Jean-François Lyotard and Jean Baudrillard, grappled with the failures of the revolutionary struggles and shifted more towards a cultural analysis of late capitalism and postmodernism, which emerged in the 1980s. Next section, Chinese hyper-capitalism. More recently, in the first decade of the 21st century, China represents a situation of hypercapitalism, economic strength, and a re-emerging Confucian nationalism that rivals the West, either in a threatening or in a more appealing way. In an interview from 2007, a French philosopher and student of Derrida named Catherine Malabou says that while capitalism is inescapable, China shows Westerners that capitalism can take multiple forms. She says that, quote, "I think that when people say they're afraid of China, what they're afraid of is to see that a Marxist country is able to demonstrate what capitalism is to us." Quote. In hindsight, the legacy of the Cultural Revolution and the events of May '68 suggest a transformation of capitalism, as we already saw with Badiou's claim. As Badiou says, the critical year here is 1967, not '68, which is also the high water mark of the Cultural Revolution, after which it regressed and became reactionary. Events in the United States also suggest that the 2 years, 1967, 1968, were politically and economically decisive. Protests against the Vietnam War reached a critical mass. The civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King shifted from a focus on eliminating Southern segregation to Northern racism and poverty. Lyndon Johnson abandoned the war on poverty and decided not to seek re-election. Finally, the assassinations of King and Robert Kennedy culminated in a tumultuous Democratic convention in 1968 that led to the election of Richard Nixon. Nixon then continued the war in Vietnam, took the United States off the gold standard in 1971, and through Henry Kissinger pursued détente with the Soviet Union and rapprochement with China. Although he is not French, the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek got his doctorate in France and has written extensively about French philosophy. In a recent book called Living in the End Times, Žižek claims that China demonstrates a certain power and excessive capitalism that both fascinates and terrifies many Western intellectuals. Looking back on the legacy of 1968, Žižek accords with Badiou in a way when he says that, quote, "What effectively happened in the aftermath of '68 was the rise of a new spirit of capitalism. The hierarchical Fordist structure of the production process was gradually abandoned and replaced with a network-based form of organization founded on employee initiative and autonomy in the workplace, at least in the United States and Western Europe. Hierarchical Fordism was outsourced along with manufacturing to China and other countries where labor was cheaper." Žižek argues that rather than communist rule hindering the development of capitalism, China developed so fast not in spite of communist rule, but in fact because of it, which is interesting. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1989, Western-style capitalism was declared triumphant, and some, like the conservative thinker Francis Fukuyama, declared that we had reached the end of history. There are two enormous problems with this self-serving narrative. First, despite the East Asian economic crisis in the 1990s, the incredible growth of the Chinese economy, along with its concomitant cultural, military, and intellectual importance, demonstrates that capitalist growth and production is not necessarily just Western, or just democratic in Western terms. Although the global financial crisis of 2008 affected the entire world, the United States and the European Union are struggling with huge debts, decaying infrastructure, high unemployment, and commitment to health care and retirement plans. One possible story of the 21st century is the decline and fall of the West compared to the rise of China. The other problem, unfortunately, is more systematic and global and relates to the strain on natural resources, minerals, energy, and environmental carrying capacity due to too much growth of population and production. We are reaching real limits to growth, and capitalism is predicated upon indefinite growth. This situation affects China profoundly because it is the most populous country on earth, and despite serious environmental efforts, has recently overtaken the United States as the leading polluter of the planet as measured in carbon emissions. Last section, two kinds of postmodernism. So in addition to this historical approach or sketch, an overview that draws out and makes explicit some of these influences and understandings of China for French philosophy, I want to consider the work of an important contemporary French sinologist, François Jullien. In the 1990s, Jullien published a provocative treatise on the Chinese concept of shi, or potentiality, called The Propensity of Things, in which he analyzes Chinese causality as a less straightforward kind of efficacy in comparison with Western versions of causality. Although Jullien says or acknowledges that the term shi is not the most obvious term or explicit term in Chinese philosophy, he argues that by focusing on the various meanings of shi, we can help, as Westerners, get, quote, a better perspective on how Chinese understanding works. Quote. He says that we can discern three things. One, an inherent potentiality at work in configuration. Two, a functional bipolarity, whether that between a sovereign and his subjects in a political situation or between the cosmic principles of heaven and earth. And this polarity is not in opposition. And then finally, third, a tendency that is generated spontaneously through interaction that proceeds to develop through alternation. And as an example, in the case of military strategy, focusing on the importance of shi, which can be translated as tendency, potentiality, or propensity, enables us to see how Chinese warfare avoids a tragic or heroic vision of confrontation, which is more common in Western and Western and Greek views of warfare. Instead of an all or nothing battle, Chinese strategy affirms that, quote, anyone who knows how to exploit strategically the potential born of disposition can lead an antagonism to resolve itself, thanks to this perfectly controllable internal pattern. In war, politics, and philosophy, the Chinese emphasis on exploiting the dynamic tendency of a situation contrasts with the stereotypical Western view of externally forcing a situation to conform to our human will. Jullien says, quote, in contrast to Western logic, which is panoramic, Chinese logic is like that of a possible journey in stages that are linked together, unquote. While the Western logic leads to antagonism and conflict, as well as a transcendent and heroic view of the individual, this Chinese logic based on shi is more conformist, but tends towards the creation of harmony. In the early 2000s, Jullien followed up with a couple more books that further develop his contrast between Chinese and traditional Western or Greek ways of understanding reality. A treatise of efficacy subtitled Between Western and Chinese Thinking, and the second, Detour and Access, Strategies of Meaning in China and Greece. Jullien argues that, quote, the notion of immanence is common to the various currents of Chinese thought, unquote, whereas Western thought is more concerned with transcendence. Jullien claims that Western thought, quote, constructs a model that is then projected onto a situation, and that implies that the situation is momentarily frozen, unquote. Conversely, Chinese thought, quote, relies on the situation as on a disposition that is known to be constantly evolving. It's more dynamic. Western thought is marked by a concern for freedom, whereas Chinese thought is more preoccupied with harmony. Jullien seeks out an other to Western thought, and he finds it in his studies of Chinese philosophy. But perhaps, and this is my question, perhaps Jullien goes too far in this opposition. He totalizes, the Western and the Chinese. And my argument, based on the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, is that in fact we can see this opposition at work within French post-structuralism or postmodernism itself. And so this is why I suggest that there may be two kinds of postmodernism. One more along the lines that Jullien is associating with the West, and one that's closer to how Jullien is understanding and describing Chinese culture and thought. So, drawing on the philosophy of Deleuze, I want to suggest that Jullien's opposition is not simply an opposition between Eastern Chinese and Western Greek forms of thinking, but also, importantly, a difference in opposition or difference between two ways of understanding recent French philosophy. In his masterpiece, Difference and Repetition, Deleuze contrasts the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre with the phenomenological philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty and their interpretations of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's shadow looms over all of these French post-structuralist thinkers. Heidegger, keep in mind also about Heidegger that he himself undertook in 1946 a translation of the Tao Te Ching from Chinese into German with the help of a Chinese scholar, Paul Shi Xiao, even though this effort was ultimately not successful, not completed. Deleuze says, and again this is talking about Heidegger, but then these two French understandings of Heidegger, that Merleau-Ponty undoubtedly followed a more thoroughly Heideggerian inspiration in speaking of folds and pleating, in contrast with Sartrean wholes and lakes of non-being from the phenomenology of perception onward. The phenomenology of perception is Maurice Merleau-Ponty's great, big, influential book. Both of these philosophies, that is, Sartre's and Merleau-Ponty's, are two ways to understand what Heidegger calls ontological difference, or the difference between being in itself and a particular or determinate being. According to Deleuze, step back a second. Heidegger uses the term not or nothing, das nicht, to indicate the difference between being and being. And according to Deleuze, Sartre understands this not in more straightforwardly negative terms, as a kind of break or rupture between being and being, a kind of non-being. This break installs a kind of transcendence that then characterizes as Greek thought and subsequent Western philosophy, according to Julien, or in the terms that we saw Julien describing this. But Merleau-Ponty views Heidegger's ontological difference less as a break and more as a folding of being in a determinate being that is less transcendent and more immanent. And this is closer to the way that Julien understands Chinese thought. Deleuze, in his own work, mostly follows Merleau-Ponty, and in a later book called The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque, Deleuze elaborates a metaphysics of the fold and its harmonious accord from Leibniz to the Anglo-American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead and then beyond. At the same time, Deleuze, in his philosophy, doesn't simply oppose the fold to the cut, but he also makes use of the idea of a cut or break in his influential works on cinema. This is just a preliminary sketch. However, on the one hand, we can view French post-structuralism as concerned with existential questions of intentional access and transcendence of subject over object or environment, following the influence of Jean-Paul Sartre as well as Georges Bataille, and this can be seen in the ethical transcendence of Emmanuel Levinas. This view of philosophy emphasizes non-being and the breaks or gaps between beings that function to perpetuate access to transcendent power and achieve a kind of absolute liberty of the subject. That's the one kind of postmodernism, one way to view French post-structuralism. On the other hand, we can see a different version of postmodernism that is more similar to and compatible with Chinese thought and understanding, at least in terms of Julien's work. And this views reality more in terms of immanent becomings and folds as tendencies and propensities in the way that Julien talks about, rather than breaks. Deleuze contrasts a philosophy of folds associated with Merleau-Ponty with a philosophy of cuts or breaks based on Sartre as a way of tracing the influence of Martin Heidegger's thought on French philosophy, although, as I said, he later incorporates both notions of fold and cut into his own philosophy. I'm drawing on Deleuze as well as Julien to make a constructive argument that we can identify a quasi-Chinese fold of French post-structuralism. Thank you very much for listening.